Hello again, everyone. I'm Mike Goucher, and welcome to On the Issues at Marquette University Law School, or at least a virtual version of the law school. We are here today to release the latest results of our Marquette University Law School poll. And to walk us through the numbers, as he always does, is Professor Charles Franklin, who is the director of the poll. Charles, great to be back with you for this latest release. Let's talk about when we were in the field, the number of people sampled, margin of error, that sort of thing.
Thank you, Mike. We were in the field last Sunday through Thursday. We talked to 805 people on a combination of cell phones and landlines, about 65% cell phone and the rest landline. And that has a margin of error of plus or minus 4.3 percentage points.
And Charles, a quick question about composition of the sample. Pretty typical. Any differences that we saw this time?
Yeah, the sample this month is right close to the long-term average of party support. Republicans have 1% more than Democrats. That's the long-term average. We're right at that. It's a little different if you include leaners than if you don't include leaners. All those details are on the website in the press release, at the bottom of the press release, as we do every time we have all those details for people that want to sort them out.
So according to most of the experts, Wisconsin remains a key battleground state in this year's election. And we have been, over the last few polls, looking at the potential horse race between President Trump and former Vice President Biden. Let's begin there. Let's talk about how they did this time and compare it to how they've done in previous polls.
Right. We've seen very stable polling through the spring, but this poll, there's a bigger move towards Biden. In this month's poll in June, we have Biden at 49%, Trump at 41%, an 8-point margin with registered voters. That was a 3-point margin in May, and it was 3 points in March. If you go all the way back to February, we had a tie at 46 apiece. So this has been a good gain for Biden at this point. And it's a relatively widespread gain. He's picking up across different regions and different groups.
The president's job approval, Charles, is it down a little bit?
Down just a little bit to 45 approve, 51 disapprove on his overall job approval. That's down 2 points from a month ago. You have to appreciate how stable the president's job approval has been since he took office, really. Our all-time low for him is just 41%. And this year, we've been at 48 or 47 or 45, and the 45 is the low point. You have to go back to August of 2019 to find a poll where he was as low as 45 in our recent polling.
Let's look
Still, a very narrow range, I should say.
Absolutely, yeah. Let's look at the potential reasons for why this margin has widened a little bit in this race, Charles. The president's had a lot on his plate. A pandemic, the protests in response to the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis police custody, the economy's issues, of course, resulting from the pandemic. Those issues, are they taking a toll on his numbers?
They certainly seem to be. And while his overall job approval has been so stable for a long time, we find a real range on specific issues. How Trump is handling the protests, only 30% approve, 58% disapprove. That's quite low compared to his 45% overall approval. On handling the coronavirus, 44% approve, just a shade below, and that's unchanged from last month, I should say. And finally, on handling the economy, 50% approve, 46% disapprove, but that is down a little bit from 54% approval a month ago. So you see a range of specifics here, but even his strong suit of the economy seems to have weakened a little bit, and the newest of national crises, the protests over police violence, is really a strikingly weak spot for him.
Let's spend some time on the protests and how the public feels about police and police actions. The protests in general, the ones that we saw all over this country, that we saw in Milwaukee, but also in smaller towns all across Wisconsin. How does the Wisconsin voter feel about those protests?
Overall, pretty positive. 61% said they approve of the protests. 36% said they do not. I think that's striking. There's been a lot of conversation about how the protests now compare to 1968, but that's quite a different story. To see more than 60% who approve of the current protests says that the country as a whole is looking at the protests in a very different way than they looked at the 1968 protests and riots following assassinations and other things.
What about attitudes toward police and attitudes toward the Black Lives Matter movement, for that matter?
We as a state are very positive towards the police. 72% have a favorable view of the police, but 59% have a favorable view of the Black Lives Matter movement. So police usually get good marks in the state, but I think it's striking that Black Lives Matter is now very comfortably over half with a positive impression. And again, that follows on with reaction being a little different this time than it may have been in the past.
Some questions about police actions and people's interactions with police, for that matter, Charles. Let's talk a little bit about that. First of all, how do people feel about if they encounter police, they come in contact with police, how do they feel? They feel comfortable? Do they feel anxious? What did we find from voters?
I think the striking thing here is how different perceptions are across groups. Overall, 86% say they feel safe around the police. Just 11% say they feel anxious. But among African Americans, it's only 43% who feel safe, 44% feel anxious. And among Hispanics, 72% feel safe, but 28% feel anxious. Whites, on the other hand, are very comfortable around the police. Over 90% say they feel comfortable with police. And I think that's a striking point, and it pervades these data that African Americans and to a substantial extent Hispanics have different experiences with the police and have very different perspectives on the police use of violence and the comfort you feel around them, whereas whites are much more positive towards the police.
Let's dig a little deeper on that point, Charles. First of all, police using deadly force. How do people feel about that? And when we talk about people of color, white people, how do they feel? Are police too quick to use deadly force?
Well, overall, 42% say they are too quick to use it, but 51% say they're not. And again, very big differences in perception. 68% of African Americans say they are too quick, 71% of Hispanics, but just 38% of whites and 58% of whites say they are not too quick to use deadly force. And again, I think the differences in experience are important here. Whites' experience of the police is just qualitatively different, and they bring to that a much more positive view of police actions than do people of color, whether they're Black or Hispanic, that in our data.
So one of the points that has been talked a lot about since the death of George Floyd is whether or not these are isolated incidents, these deaths of African Americans in police custody, or whether, in fact, there is something else happening here. This is part of a larger pattern of behavior.
In our data overall, 44% say it's just an isolated incident, but a slightly larger number, 48% say it's a part of a broader pattern. Again, big racial differences. 8% of Black respondents say it's an isolated incident. 86% say it's a broader pattern. Among Hispanics, 26% say it's an isolated incident, 72% say it's a broader pattern. But among white respondents, it's 47% isolated, 44% part of a broader pattern. I should also mention that in national polling using this question, we've seen the national data turn up into the 60s and even low 70s, saying this was a broader pattern. So in this, Wisconsin has been a little slower to catch up with a pretty rapidly changing opinion at the national level.
The George Floyd death and other deaths in recent weeks have focused also new attention on just racial attitudes in this country. and the issue of prejudice in the year 2020. We asked about that matter, the issue of racial prejudice. Does it exist? Who thinks it exists and who doesn't?
Yeah. And what we find is the question of how serious a problem is racial prejudice against Black people in particular. 41% overall say it's a very serious problem. It's 88% among Black respondents, 66% among Hispanic respondents, just 37% among white respondents. And at the opposite end of the scale, about 20% of white respondents say there is no problem with prejudice against Black people, or a very small problem. So again, we see how large the differences are in perception across racial groups.
Let's shift gears a little bit here, Charles, and talk about the pandemic, talk about where we are with the coronavirus, COVID-19. Do people still worry about getting coronavirus, or has that worry been lessened over time?
The worry has been dropping considerably since March, when we started asking about it. In March, about 30% said they were very worried about themselves personally getting COVID-19. That fell to 25% last month and is all the way down to 19% this month. And again, at the opposite end of the scale, not at all worried, has grown over that time from under 10 to now about 25% who say they're not at all worried. This reflects changing attitudes, but it also is in the midst of a pandemic that people have other concerns that have changed the way they view the virus as well, in a not so positive direction.
How people feel about the virus is reflected in their behavior. And the last poll, we asked a number of questions about things you might do. How comfortable would you be doing these various activities? We did that again in this poll. What did we see this time around, Charles?
Yeah, one thing we asked for the first time is, would you be comfortable or not comfortable with reopening schools in the fall? 54% said they'd be comfortable with reopening, 38% not comfortable. With other activities, we see a range of things from up in the 80s for people being comfortable going to dinner at a friend's home, in the 60s for shopping at a mall. Eating out at a restaurant is pretty close to 50-50. And finally, going to sporting events, big sporting events, is at about 33% this month. It was about 25% last month. So overall, when we ask the same question, people are a little more comfortable this month than last. But there hadn't been a lot of change on this. But again, you see the range from a big spectator event that people are most cautious about, to close meetings with friends and family that you know in their homes, where we're in the 80s of willingness to do that.
Well, Milwaukee was certainly hoping for a big spectator event this summer. The Democratic National Committee was going to hold its national convention in Milwaukee. As of today, it is still planning to hold some form of a convention in Milwaukee. They say the Vice President Biden will be here to accept the party's nomination. But there's still a lot of talk about what that convention is going to look like. Will it be scaled down? Certainly talk about even the Republican convention now, and maybe part of it's held in Charlotte and part of it is held in Jacksonville. So the question is, do people feel like these political conventions should be held?
Yeah, and a majority feel like they should not be held face to face. That's in the mid 50s. Those who think that we should go ahead are in the low 40s. But that hasn't changed much since we asked about it a month or so ago. But it does show that there's a reluctance to hold an event that brings thousands and thousands of people in for a party convention.
Charles, earlier we talked about President Trump's handling of the coronavirus. How does Governor Evers fare when we ask voters about that?
In terms of handling the COVID disease, 58% approve of the job he's doing, 37% disapprove. This has moved steadily down during the crisis. The approval was in the 70s in March, had fallen into the 60s last month, and now is in the high 50s. That's a substantial approval, but it's not the stratospheric approval we saw at the beginning of the COVID crisis.
And with the benefit of 2020 hindsight, how do people feel about the actions that were taken to deal with COVID, the closings of schools and businesses? Do they feel that was the right thing to do, or do they now feel that was an overreaction?
There's strong support still, even in retrospect. 72% say closing was the right thing to do. Just 25% say it was an overreaction. That's barely changed from last month, but slightly up in saying it was the right thing to do. So while there may be a little more disgruntlement, a little more willingness to take some risks, for example, the views about the closing itself are below where they were in March, but have been steady in May and now June.
So let's go back to wrap things up, Charles, to sort of the lead of this poll, I guess, and that is the somewhat larger margin between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And I do want to end with just a couple of things that are probably important to touch on. The first one is the movement. Where are those? Where is the support going to Biden and moving away from Trump? Who are those people?
Well, I think the most notable change is that in June, people who consider themselves political independents, a plurality favored Trump over Biden. But this month, that's reversed with a plurality favoring Biden over Trump. This is not a big part of the electorate. Pure independents are less than 10% of registered voters. But they are also the group that can shift the most. And I think the shifts from last month to this show that they have moved in the same direction that we've seen in national polling and we see in our statewide poll here, moved in the direction of Joe Biden. The other change that stands out is Republicans who had been voting for Trump at a 93% rate fell off into the 80s this time. That's a bit of a dip among his core supporters. And I would caution that 1 month doesn't mean it'll necessarily stay that way. But since we've been used to seeing his support among Republicans above 90%, it's notable this month that it drops below 90 for the first time in a while.
And one other thing to keep an eye on, I guess, from this point moving forward, a question that we have asked in many a poll in the past, Charles, and this is sort of the empathy question. Does the president, does Joe Biden care about someone like me? Does he understand me? Does he get me? Does he understand my life? What did we find with this poll?
In this case, for President Trump, 39% say he cares about people like them. 57% say he does not. So he's substantially underwater on that question. For Biden, it's 46 say he cares, 42 say he does not, slightly above water. We'll keep an eye on this as we go through the campaign. This is not necessarily the only thing that matters in elections, but it's a potential strength for Biden and a weakness for Trump, especially if we see this continue throughout the summer and into the fall.
And Charles, for people interested in the full survey, and maybe there are a couple things that you feel particularly strongly about that we haven't talked about here, maybe the impact on the economy of Wisconsin, the pandemic, but where can you find all that information?
Everything is on our website at law.marquette.edu/poll, P-O-L-L. If you go to that page, you will see the press release. And if you look up top, there's a little tiny drop-down menu that says results and data. If you click through to that, you'll see absolutely everything. Every question we ask, the results to every question, a whole bunch of crosstabs you can look at, and so on.
Yeah, and we updated that crosstabs feature. It's great. A lot of good feedback on that. So, Charles, thanks very much. Appreciate your time today. Thanks for walking us through the numbers, and thanks to all of you who are watching today this issue of On the Issues.